Let's see if this thing actually works. Before I get started, just kind of a funny thing, as I was listening to the previous speakers and thinking about things, the kind of connections we have. It's a very small industry, obviously. And before we get into the presentation, I thought, well, Jose, when he was up here speaking, I thought, I remember Jose. He said he's been at Freeport for 15 years. Wow, I was there on his first day, and I was part of the process that brought him on board. And then I left Freeport not long after he joined to go work for Infosol. And I remember being interviewed by this guy named Jean-Francois, who had a really funny accent, and I had a hard time keeping track of him. And then as I was working at Infosol not long before I left, a lady named Renali started working there. And coincidentally enough, my very first contract with Infosol was with a company called J.F. Shea, working for a dude named Chris Sinkowitz, who has someone who looks similar to him in the building as well. So as you start looking around the room and think about all the connections we have, it's kind of nice. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak and talk a little bit about something that I personally have an interest in and an investment, but also I think is probably worthy of everybody being engaged and thinking about. As we get into data governance, I have a couple of quick questions to ask the audience. The first one is anyone in here on a data governance team or in a data governance organization by title? By direct title, you are the data governance guy. Tommy's like, oh, I don't know. You got to help a brother out here. What do you mean? What does that mean?
What is my title?
That's a bad sign, by the way. You should know that one.
I don't remember the exact title.
Okay.
Because I'm not on the official data governance board, but I'm for my department, I'm the data.
You're like a representative on the data governance board, if I can put words in your mouth. What's your actual title, though?
I'm trying to remember. I can't remember.
Is it?
No. I have a data, like for the data governance.
No.
Like
Not that.
Data governance person.
When someone comes to you and says, hey, we're going to do your annual review, and we're going to say whether or not you get a raise and whether or not you did a good job, what is your title?
Financial reporting analyst.
Financial reporting. Okay, perfect. Hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Thank you. That's perfect. I was hoping someone would give me that information. Anybody else? Anybody else in data governance by title, by role, by responsibility? Okay. That's not surprising. My next question is, who in here actually has a data governance organization within their organization? I know one. We got the city here. Everyone's like, no, I don't know. What the hell does that even mean, right? Well, part of this discussion is to get to that, right? We want to talk a little bit about what data governance actually is, as it's kind of changed over time. As a business intelligence practitioner, you say, well, how does business intelligence and data governance fit together? Are they separate? Are they the same? Are they holding hands? Are they in conflict? Yes, is the answer. All the above. So as we go through this, I want to give you a little bit of my insight and perspective. Quick agenda. We're going to really talk about who I am. Has anyone been to one of these sessions before that I've done? I'd recognize, obviously, a few people here. But when we go through this is supposed to be very interactive. So I actually have less on the slides than I probably should. And I'm looking for you guys to help fill in a lot of the gaps. So I'll talk a little bit about me, talk about what we're trying to accomplish here, what we want to get out on the table, talk about some of the process and major threads, topics, and then conclusion. And hopefully this will make more sense in a few minutes here. So real quick about me, my name is Ethan Durda. As mentioned before, I'm old. And over the years, I've worked across a number of different industries as both a consultant and as a full-time employee. Very recently, the last time I spoke at this, I was working for Vixo. A little bit of sad news, real life. We had a layoff, and I was part of the unfortunate many that got moved on to greener pastures. And so currently looking for that right now. So what does that look like? Consulting an FTE gig, searching, and looking for opportunities. What is it that I've done? So it's always hard to describe what do you do over a career, but I've spent a lot of my time both in leadership as well as in development of both business intelligence and general data strategy. I started off as kind of a project manager in IT, doing just random projects. I actually, at Freeport, which at the time was called Phelps Dodge, ran a little project to bring out a laboratory management system, and that's where Jose and I met. Many moons ago. And then since then, kind of bounced around, got into business intelligence, and then spent my better part of the remaining years in that specific area. The reason why I say this is not because I'm trying to apply for a job or trying to give you my resume or make you think that I know what I'm talking about, because I clearly don't. The reason why I'm telling you this is I want you to understand my biases. I want you to understand what I'm coming from, because you need to understand we all have those biases. Everybody in this room has an experience with data governance or with the lack of data governance that will shade and inform our opinions. So I know that my experience and my biases take me to so far. What I've read, what I've thought about, what I think might work takes me a little bit further. And the people in this room will take us to where we want to go, which is a shared understanding of this methodologies, the technologies, and the people and processes associated with that data governance. So let's talk a little bit about that. Someone asked for this. I don't remember who. I think it was actually part of the, by the way, that font is horrible, so my apologies if you can't read that. This actually came up as part of the board that keeps an eye on and drives the AZ BusinessObjects Crystal user group. I would encourage anyone who's not a member of that or not engaged with that to please do so, because you can ask for additional topics. And Paul asked me if I'd be interested in having this conversation with you, and thus I'm here. We are going to again use the wisdom of crowds methodology, which is a method that we've done before very successfully, I think, in this group. And it basically boils down to making some statements and trying to draw out opinions and perspective. While we focus on data governance, we're really looking for you to help. If you choose not to help, you can do that. And as Rick said, I do tend to talk too much, which means that everybody will sit around and sleep. So what is data governance? What is it supposed to do, and how does it accomplish this is what we're actually aiming for here. As we go through this, we'll start off with just a key area of concern. I'll talk about one of the different buckets that constitute data governance, walk through a couple of the SWOT items. I kind of consider these really more conversation starters, more than declarative statements by me. Talk a little bit about some of the threats, some of the challenges associated with them, and then finally move on to the next one. We really want to spend 5 or so minutes per topic line, otherwise we'll run out of time. In fact, let me keep my eye on my clock here. So real quick, what exactly is data governance? Data governance kind of has different definitions. If anyone Googles data governance, you get all sorts of interesting consultant speak, and it basically boils down to, well, whatever you want it to mean. So I'll give you the definition according to me in just a minute here, but it's basically a group of related disciplines around managing data in your organization. So what does managing data in your organization mean? Well, obviously we do a lot of stuff with data. Anyone think of an example of something that you do with data that is not really BI, but someone needs to be in charge of? Data accuracy, data quality, right? Is that really a BI function? I would argue in some ways it's the opposite of the BI function, right? Business intelligence should be about presenting the data as stated in the ERP or in the source system. We should not interpret the data before it's brought in. Why? That's profoundly dangerous, right? How many people have ever seen a report that said, had a filter on it that said something like, exclude equipment class 13? Everyone raise your hand. Yes, the answer is yes. Whoever's seen something that said, oh, exclude all invoices less than $2? Everyone nod your head yes. We've all seen it. We've all done it. Every one of us in here has been like, oh, it makes perfect sense to me. And then 10 years later, someone's looking at this going, man, you guys have totally messed up the answer because you made assumptions. And in general, again, we're speaking generalities, is that really a business intelligence function? So when we talk about data governance, we try to talk about encapsulating a lot of these different functions into a coherent group that can help answer some of these items so that business intelligence doesn't have to make that damn decision. Should we exclude equipment class 13? I don't know. Should we exclude rentals with the equipment number that's blank? It's not, how do I get to decide that, right? And yet we make those decisions all the time. So When we think about data governance, we think about it in the normal terms of people, process, and technology. As we go through these examples and talk a little bit about what I've seen and maybe what you guys have seen and what is or isn't successful, I want you to think a little bit about how these things work across one another. Now, the comment was made, and I'm going to say this about 80 times, about, well, I'm on the data governance committee. Well, why does it need to be in a committee? Well, the answer is because no one group or one person really should have ownership of some of these things. And what data governance ultimately is then is a combination of people, process, and technology driving towards enforcing decisions and methodologies that keep the decisions that are made in sync. To that end, roles and responsibilities are the key to success, and likewise, a lack of clear roles and responsibility are the keys to failure. I say that very clearly because I want to be also clear that you can also design solutions that don't work. That's like one of the easiest things in the world to do. So we want to be honest about that. Few, if any, solutions in this space are truly complete. They usually run into people problems. I love seeing software companies or consultancies come out with data governance solutions, and you look at it and say, what? That doesn't even make sense, because how are you going to solve problem X, which is a pure people problem? A company I was working with, we had a problem where basically we had different workflows for a number of different processes that should have been the same. So you ended up with data that was all mixed up. Sometimes it'd have a value, sometimes it wouldn't. We use this field instead of that field. And so you end up with these really goofy reports and dashboards that ultimately didn't make anyone happy. So they said, oh, we're going to apply data governance to it. And everyone goes, yeah. I read an article about that on Harvard Business Review. And then they pulled it up, and what did they end up actually doing? I'm not even joking. We had the entire executive team in this meeting. It was the CEO, CFO, CTO, the actual legal, the chief legal officer in there. We had all these people in there that we were going to get our arms around data governance. And after an hour and a half, we walked out, absolutely nothing was done. And it was fascinating to me because as we'd gotten the people in the room to actually start making decisions and gaining traction, they realized that none of them really knew what the problem was. They knew there was a problem, or they thought there was a problem. But what they were really complaining about were symptoms of things that they couldn't control, or symptoms of processes that they didn't have the willingness to change. So when you start getting into what the solution is, sometimes you have to be very, very careful not to go too broad. And so as we go through some of these examples, I want you to think about what it means to get into data governance. And now that we have a data governance board member in the room, he can share some.
I'm just part of the team.
No,
On the actual board.
you're stuck. You're on the hook for us.
Data coordinator.
Data coordinator. There you go. But as you're thinking about that, I want you to think about why it is that we still have these problems. Because one would think we can just make a decision, right? Hey, we're going to use field X to load this value. Problem solved. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? This is the CEO in the room. He can make all sorts of declarative decisions, right? It doesn't work like that. That's just not real life. And that's why data governance as an organizational event has grown in popularity. Interestingly enough, if I had had this conversation with a group like this 10 years ago, no one would have had any concept of what I was talking about, because it didn't truly exist. This is stuff that's grown up over the years. Although data governance started in the government, in the federal government back in the 60s and 70s. So this isn't a new concept, but it's certainly grown over time and starting to become more and more relevant. So data governance is rarely run out of a single organization. I want to be clear about this. This is a committee type problem for a reason. It has to be, because these things are very, very rarely single system or single application issues. And more importantly, the people that are putting the values in column X versus column Y, they usually don't give a rat's ass, right? The impact of it affects other people. So in the mining industry, where I spent a lot of my career, you've got two different people. One guy who drills the hole and fills it full of explosives and blows up the earth. And there's another group that picks up the rocks and drops them in the truck and hauls them down and crushes them up into small little rocks. And you think about it, these are two different cost centers. And they have profoundly different motivations, right? The dude who blows up the rock, what's his expense? Explosives. That's right. It's labor and explosives, right? So the fewer holes he drills and the less explosive he puts in there, guess what? He looks at rock star, right? Then there's the poor dude who has to pick up the rocks. Man, this thing's the size of a Volkswagen. Now he has to crush that thing down. He ends up having to put somebody on it with a jackhammer to break it up. Now his labor costs go through the roof. So you have these two groups that have opposite business requirements. One of them says, drill 8,000 holes and blow that thing into sand. The other guy says, no, I'm going to give you Volkswagen Beetles, and you guys can just figure out what you're going to do with them down the road. How many conversations, I'm going to pick on Jose here. How many conversations do we have about that in the mining industry? Oh, I don't know, on a weekly basis, right? Literally on a weekly basis. That is just the way the world works. So when we think about these committees, when we think about all the people who have different opinions and quite frankly different motivations, this is what data governance is all about. All right, we're almost done with Ethan blabbing on and on and on, but I wanted to get a couple foundational things out of the way. So the next thing is really about what I would refer to as the scope of data governance, and this varies by organization. I'm trying to think of some specific examples. Some organizations actually have very, very, very narrow scopes for data governance, and they don't have all 11 of these. They actually would only have like master data management, data quality. They come and go together and are referred to as the data governance model. Some are a bit wider. This particular chart that I found, I think it's probably a touch too wide because it covers the reporting side of it as well, which isn't always a bad thing, but you leave off stuff like KPIs and design of the data. You sort of have it up here in data modeling and database design, but very quickly you start seeing, well, these two kind of go together more so than like this and database operations and management. So this is useful, but I want to be profoundly clear. I neither consider this complete nor do I consider it 100% accurate, but it's a good place to start the conversation. Obviously, as we go through today's discussion, if you look at your clock and more importantly, look at your watch and figure out what your ride home is today, I don't think anyone wants to go through all of these, which is convenient because I only prepared for 4 of them. But more importantly, what I'd like to do is say, as we talk about these 4, we really want to think about what it means to, in this case, data management and MDM, quality and MDM, how do they fit together? What is reference master data management? Should this be considered part of master data management? Should it be separate? Let's talk about those kind of things in this group. Once we start getting into some of the more details like data security, I actually thought data security truly should be an entire half an hour in and of itself. Real quick, show of hands, has anyone in this room had a data breach that they know about? Okay, you've all had one. Does anyone know about their data breaches yet? Okay, does anybody salt their databases, their data warehouses? Do you have encrypted data at rest and in flight? Do these words mean anything to you? Am I making these words up? Salting databases is one of my favorite phrases. I don't know why, it makes me smile. And yet you say it and people go, salting database. Does anyone know what that means? What's the biggest problem with encryption? At the end of the day, what's the biggest problem with encryption? Anything being encrypted? It can be broken, it can be hacked, right? So computers are really, really fast, and they're getting immensely faster. So if I have a bit of data, let's say I've got an old World War II code. Does anyone know, and I'm going to give you a really old history lesson. Does anyone know how they cracked the German code during World War II? What's that? Yeah, the Turing and all that stuff. You guys probably watched the movie. I don't even remember if they talked about this in the movie. But ultimately, what's that? Yeah, whatever that guy's name is. But Turing was the guy. I'm getting the names wrong here. But anyway, at the end of the day, they solved the encryption by a really interesting solution. The encryption always worked the same way, but it had a different key, right? What did every single message that the Germans sent end with? Heil Hitler. Okay? They'd send a weather report out, and at the end of it, they'd say, oh, Heil Hitler. So guess what they had to do? Figure out the code to translate the last 2 words, and everything backwards became breakable. Okay? That's how codes get broken. So what salting is we put crap in the database that's bogus. We put bad data in the database that's actually not real. So these cracking algorithms will go through and they'll find this bad data and they'll screw up their algorithm, okay, functionally. There's a lot more details there, but it's me getting off track. So the point of the story is that that's a really fascinating whole thing to get into. I'm probably not qualified to speak to it, honestly. But more importantly, I think that definitely qualifies as an interesting topic going forward if people are looking to be bored. Okay? So I picked these four. To be honest with you, I was going to open up the door if somebody really wanted to dive in on one of these other ones, and I changed my mind. So we'll just go ahead and go through the four that I've got picked, and quite frankly, leave the door open for future conversations. All right, so the first one we're going to do is data quality, only because it was the first one I grabbed. Data quality means a little bit more than just the right data in the database, and I say right in quotation marks for a reason. Why do I say right is not a real designation for data? That sounds contrary to real life, doesn't it? There's the right value to everything, right? Sort of.
It may be right, but it may not be what it was intended to be by definition.
Well, it's a function of the value itself and the context, right? Has anybody been in a discussion with two very well-intentioned people talking about the difference between sales values? What is our sales this month? Well, depends. Does sales include returns? Do we put a negative for returns? Does sales include things that we've purchased, that we've sold, but we haven't delivered yet?
Well, sorry to interrupt, but we're not talking about data, but interpretation of data here. The facts are the facts. The invoices are the invoices.
But do I know that I should count that one or not?
Well, you're
Yeah, you're getting ready to
But
close
in
the
your
books,
database,
so which ones do you do?
is the invoice properly input? That's the way I understand data quality. Is there, I'm thinking of a fleet management company who has.
Yeah, I was going to give you an example with that, just 2 seconds.
28 versions of the spelling for F-150 in the database. That's
Given
quality.
that, why wouldn't there only be one definition of no?
Well,
Right.
let me give JF, and like I said, I'm going to use a personal analogy that both of us are clear with, so let me give a little context. We both did some work for a company that rents boxes, steel boxes. And at Mobile Mini, I had the opportunity to sit down in a room with the CEO and the CFO and the COO. So the three top people in the organization. And I said, guys, how do you define units on rent? Okay? The lowest common denominator KPI, characteristic, or data point in the company, which is how many boxes are earning you money right now. Guess what they couldn't agree on? The definition for units on rent. Okay? Why? Because real life sucks. It's complex. Real life is, well, okay, we're still getting money for this box, but we took it off rent yet. We took it physically off site yesterday, but we're still getting revenue for it for another 2 days because the month's not over yet. But we delivered it to the next dude and he's paying me rent for it too. So I'm actually technically getting rent for ×2 for this one box. Okay. So is that 2 units on rent or 1? Three guys in the room, each making 7 figures a year. Can't agree on that. Okay? I'm not telling you which one's right or wrong because I don't have an opinion.
Right.
In theory, I shouldn't. But when you talk about data quality, if you don't have context in there, simply saying units on rent is not a meaningful distinction. You have to have that context.
Right, but I think it's a question of definition we're not agreeing here.
Fair enough.
When I think data quality, and I may have, again, wrong definition.
No.
In your example, I know the physical location of the box and how much money I'm getting. Those are facts. You don't have to agree or not. Those are real. It's the reality. And to me, data quality is it correctly input in the database. So
The value.
are we talking about the same thing? Is really that what you're talking
I-
about something that is derived from the facts. not the facts. The facts are the facts.
Well, I'm not to run down that rabbit hole completely. I agree with you. I think that's the problem. The nuance is, in this particular case, yes, we know how many are there and we know how much money we're getting, but, well, we haven't cashed the check yet, and we get a 10% return, and we have a 3% bad debt write-off, and we have. So how do we define these things? So when I say it's not just the data, that's exactly what I'm saying. Just because you have a 4 in the database doesn't necessarily mean 4 is the right answer. So when I present 4 back to the business, I may or may not be giving them the right answer. When you start talking about it in terms of data governance, that's the challenge that we just described. In this little abstract conversation, we start very quickly running into real life challenges with it. So when you start getting into very big deployments or environments, that becomes super hard. We spend a ton of time trying to define quality because we're trying to define what the actual right value is. So I'm going to ask for an example here. Do you guys have data quality covered underneath your data governance model, or do you guys consider that separate? Gracias.
I believe it's part of our model, yeah.
Okay, because sometimes it's separate. And that's why I'm asking. So I want to be very clear, because sometimes data quality becomes, to JF's point, a strictly, does this match source system and full stop? Other times data quality is, does it match source system and does it accurately reflect the business attributes, values, etc.? Sometimes it's all the above plus an interpretive layer on top of it, such as, oh, we don't ever give a sales number, we give a sales less returns number, because that's what we want everyone to think about when they say sales. Or in the case of business of the city, I'm trying to think of a good example, miles of streets repaved per year or something like that isn't really the number you think it is because of averages and half-milers and how they're treated, et cetera. I don't know. I'm making that up. It may be a horrible example.
No,
You got to work with me.
Example we do it in mining is when we're doing the costs per department, then people are used to see the cost without energy or with energy. Then you show the cost with energy and say that's wrong. Say no, it's not wrong. That's the cost. No, you have to remove energy out of the equation. I thought, why?
Electricity's free, clearly. Diesel's free. We don't pay for that. It's magic.
Diesel, we don't pay electricity. It's crazy. That's a different concept.
It's somebody else's problem. I can't control that. He used that as an example because that's actually a really big problem in the mining industry. Does anyone remember, man, this was a long time ago. Some of you guys were like in junior high. But when electricity prices went through the roof, this would have been, no, not that old. That was, now you're really dating us. I'm thinking like back when California did that deregulation and electricity prices went through, skyrocketed. That was back in the Enron days. I want to say 2002, 2003, something like that. Más o menos. Does anyone remember that? That leaked out? Okay. It was really interesting because we actually had mines that shut down and sold their electricity back to the public utility and made more money than they would have made mining. Okay? So that's an example where they actually had to make some very, very challenging business decisions based on the reality around them. So they started separating things out like energy, because that actually changed the dynamics of everything, and therefore it didn't make sense to add into their normal expenses. Little factoid for you. Everybody hear about that? I'm not making that up. There's actually an aluminum factory up in Washington State that sent all their employees home for a year, full pay. They said, we're done. We're going to sell it. We sold all of our electricity back to the grid for the next 12 months. Everybody enjoy your 12-month vacation.
Here's your Christmas bonus.
Here's everybody. Everyone's getting paid, full pay, full benefits. No one show up for work. We'll see you in 12 months. No joke. That actually happened. I cannot imagine how excited people were coming home. Hey, honey, guess what?
Well, probably drove the wives.
No, you're going to work. You're delivering pizzas. No. But that's real life, right? Real life's messy. And when you start thinking about this data, it really kind of has that messy feel to it sometimes. All right, any other questions about quality? We've done exactly one topic, boys and girls. All right. Data development. Data development's a weird term. I didn't really like the term at first, and as I was preparing this slide, I pulled that ring maybe 2 weeks ago, and looked for some different ones because this is one of the ones I didn't really like. But over time, I kind of liked it a little bit more, because this concept that data doesn't inherently have value. If I just give you a number and say, "Here, John, 4," are you excited or you don't care? It's a number, right? I mean, it's just like ones and zeros. It's like, great, congratulations. Until it's organized, it actually isn't useful to me.
How'd you come up with Ford?
Yeah, how'd you come up with Ford? What is it reference to? Is that $4 billion in your next paycheck? Or is it 4 dead cats that are at your house, right? 4 doesn't actually have any particular meaning to it. But likewise, the way we shape the data and the way we build things into a format matters a lot. So when I talk about shapes, I'm talking about building it into a consumable format. And as you can see, Wile E. Coyote there is in a spring format with a flat head as he's had something dropped on him. He doesn't very much look like Wile E. Coyote right now, right? You kind of know who he is, but he's in a different shape. We do that with data all the time. Some examples of that include things like many-to-many. When we have relationships in the data that don't necessarily reflect what the business thinks of the data, we have to then reshape it. That reshaping comes at a cost. How do we make those decisions? And more importantly, once we make those decisions, how do we educate and get the consumers of that in alignment with that reshaping? Functionally, that's what data governance and data governance boards are all about, because they're the only ones who can make those kind of decisions across the entire enterprise. Why does it matter that we do that? Well, because it's so hard to answer questions like many-to-many, especially if you have a big SAP implementation or some other big ERP, or you've got lots of little systems that don't really totally match each other, you have to make some of these kind of decisions here, especially around things like hierarchies. How do we set things up in a way that all the hierarchies line up cleanly? Well, they don't usually, right? They almost never do. So when making those alignments, we have to reshape the data. Fill in a blank here, put an NA here. Hey, when I do a search for this, how do I want the data to behave? That's shaping the data. We do lots of work in this area, even when people don't realize it. You'll almost never hear anybody say, hey, the data shape is weird, or this doesn't answer the problem. What they'll instead come back and say is, hey, these customers don't have the right hierarchies, or the hierarchies don't match between these two different customer groups, or hey, these products don't roll up the way I'd like to think that they should. And the answer can be master data, but it can also be data shape, because sometimes, for instance, we don't know what the material group is until after the material's been produced. Little weird things like that. So let's talk about that. Does anybody within, and again, I'm sorry, I'm keeping on picking on you, within your data governance group, do you guys consider data shape, or is that left to the hand of the architect? And I ask, that's a loaded question, because I don't know that you know the answer, but my experience has been most of the time that's left up in the hands of the data architects.
So, in my experience with the head of the group and also with the departments, they have to kind of come up with it on their side, and we rely on the departments to have an idea of what their hierarchy is going to look like, and then it's kind of like a team effort.
Mm-hmm. Again, loaded question. Who is the bigger driver or contributor to the decision making? The business or the IT people in the room? I know a hard question that you'll get that you don't want anyone in the room. It's a hard question. My experience, the business people are the most impacted, but usually have the least amount to input on it because they don't understand it. As you give them specific examples, yes, they can tell you how they want it to act. But it gets...
In my specific department, it's the business people. We built our own hierarchy.
Perfect.
But I can't speak to every department.
And that's huge, because that's kind of the point behind this. And when I prepped this up and I spun up this discussion, I talked a lot about how it's going to be people, process, and tech. And if we think about that people side, who are those people? It's almost always should be the business, right? Should some random IT guy, and I've been in IT for a long time, I pretty much live there now. If I'm a random IT guy, should I have the ability to make the decision associated with how your hierarchy should roll together and how they should compare across the organization? I would say, hell no. If my business hat goes on, I start off as an accountant. The last thing I want is some random IT guy going in there and mucking around with how things roll up, right? And yet, if you don't have that organization and that data governance model, who ends up having to always make those decisions? Who has to always make the compromising decisions? Right? That's the purpose behind a data governance organization. Forcing everyone to get together, have these hard conversations, make these hard compromises, and ultimately live with them. And you'll need to change them and fix them, but whatever. We're not pouring concrete usually. But you have to force people to have those conversations. Okay. Any other thoughts on this one? I'll get into the last one. We're not going to have time to do all four, but I'll do at least the next one, at least get that one started. Master data management. This is actually sometimes a separate group altogether, sometimes related to data governance, but it's actually often not underneath the data governance umbrella, which is really weird to me. When we think about master data management, I want to talk a little bit about defining, controlling, updating, and distribution. So master data management in the context of this definition refers to master data. What is master data? Customer names, vendors, materials, employees, parts, products, etc. Things that in theory are germane to the entire business, and there's no difference in definition between them, right? So Joe's Plumbing, whether he sells to this mine or that mine, Dave's Construction, whether he rents from this part of the facility or that part of the facility, Microsoft, whether they're selling product to this subunit or that subunit, should all be considered uniquely the same across the organization. That's how we manage them, right? The downside is that sometimes they're kind of not 100% the same, right? Microsoft has many divisions. Does the Azure Cloud group get treated the same as the desktop support group? Well, they have different contracts. I mean, they're managed by different people. So even though we call it Microsoft,